Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome all to this 33rd AGM. I am going to talk about the future of economics in the 21st century. All right, so with the global financial crisis in 2007, there was a widespread recognition that there is something seriously wrong with the discipline of economics. So I've just listed a small smattering of quotations from leading economists and policy makers, and this could be multiplied amply. It would become boring very quickly. But for example, the head of the Federal Reserve Board said that today they are using toy models to forecast economies. We don't have anything real and substantial on the ground which can actually be relied upon in industrial strength applications that we are making. So this is really unsatisfactory. In fact, the current head of the just recently retired from USA Federal Monetary Policy Board, he said that we don't have a working theory of inflation, so it's very difficult to conduct monetary policy when you don't know what you're doing. And that is true actually, in the sense that all of the major theories of inflation that we have are known to be refuted by the data. That is, the simplest theory is of course the quantity theory of money, and the data shows that this is not true. And then there are many, many more 5 or 6 major sophisticated theories, all of which can be proven wrong by the data. So there is no existing currently any valid and viable theory of inflation. So we are working in the dark as it is. Olivier Blanchard, famous IMF chief economist, he says that the assumptions that we use in the macro models, the DSG, are not just wrong, but they are profoundly at odds what we know about the real world. Romer, another famous economist, said that whose textbooks are taught all over the world, for the past few decades, macro has been going backwards, and it's completely unscientific, and we use concepts like phlogiston and any non-existent entities to explain real world changes. This is the among the economists, but the problem is widely recognized outside the profession. So the Queen of England went to the London School of Economics and said, "Why didn't you guys tell me anything? How come nobody saw this coming?" And similarly, the US Congress, not a very high intellectual organization, appointed a committee to investigate the failure of economics to anticipate the financial crisis and the subsequent failure to provide a reasonable remedy, which is still true. So this could be multiplied ad nauseum, but this is just to explain that the state of the art is far from satisfactory. So the need for the revolution in economic theory is widely realized, but at the same time, it is strongly resisted. Since the global financial crisis, mainstream economists have consistently been producing seriously wrong forecasts. Very seriously wrong policies are being made on the basis of theories which are known to be wrong. The Wall Street risk managers are still using the same arch-garch models which failed completely to predict the risk in the global financial crisis. There's just no alternative. Although there are alternatives, but actually there is a resistance on the part of the orthodoxy to change. There is this man, Nicholas Nassim Taleb, who has been talking about black swans and how genuine risk is really not quantifiable. But this is a leap which the profession as a whole is unwilling to take, because the idea that we can measure and enumerate everything is very strong and dominant. I mean, it's all over, and it's actually taking over the idea of that you can always measure everything. You can have key performance indicators. You can measure the quality of research by, counting the number of papers. This is fundamentally a wrong idea, but this is the dominant idea, and it's very resistant to change. So Thomas Kuhn said that new paradigms don't take over by converting people, but it is because the people who the old paradigm die out and the younger generation are attracted. So basically my hope is from the students of PIDE and other institutions that they will come up with the new ideas, because Max Planck, who introduced quantum mechanics, could not get his contemporaries to accept his ideas. So eventually in his desperation he said that science progresses one funeral at a time. Paradigm shifts are very difficult to achieve. You have to catch people young and train them in the new. So the question is, who will launch the revolution that is everybody recognizes the need for? Well, Keynes launched the revolution, face exactly very similar circumstances in the 1940s, 30s, when the economic theory of the time had completely failed to predict the Great Depression. 30 years ago was that some people realized that the idea that calories, in the health industry, the main culprit for the heart attacks, the cholesterol, is not, contrary to what's widely believed, oil and ghee, but rather it's sugar. But the people who found this research launched a revolution, and the mainstream people had already staked out their position. And so this research was ridiculed and discarded, and as a result, America became obese. So these things happen, that it's not, the truth does not prevail. Actually, it's power and status and rank and prestige and entrenched orthodoxy which governs what is going to be said. So the point is that in the USA and in the mainstream countries, the orthodoxy is very deeply, solidly entrenched. So there is much more hope of launching a revolution here in the periphery than there is in the in the main stream. So that's just preliminaries. Now we come to how can we rebuild the discipline of economics. So actually, for that we have to retrace the steps. How did we get to this point? So it turns out that if you look at the history of ideas, how economics came to be what it is today, you find that when you retrace the steps, there are three major mistakes that were made. And each of them has had a dramatic impact on the shape that economics takes today. And each of these, as I said earlier, the truth doesn't win always. In fact, as the Bible says, that the battle is not always to the strong, nor the race to the swift. So very often it happens that by historical accidents, the wrong party wins, and then their ideas become dominant, even though they are wrong. So the first major mistake was that there was everybody knows there was a big battle between science and religion, in which science won the battle. Now there's lots of detail as to what really happened. But from our point of view, what happened was that the West suffered trauma because of this rejection of religion. And as a result, they started to distrust anything invisible. So, and they started to worship science, and they said that science is the only source of valid knowledge. Now, that is a problem, and science obviously produces valid knowledge, there's no doubt about it, but there are other sources of knowledge. For example, I know how my wife feels by looking at her. Now, that is not science, it is the communication of the hearts. And there is, in fact, most of the knowledge that we use in our lives is not scientific knowledge. It is personal, experiential. It varies from moment to moment. It cannot be systematized, and so on. So throwing out that kind of knowledge, and actually morality was also thrown into the garbage. That was a major problem. We will discuss later more in greater detail. The second problem occurred in the 1890s or so. There was a battle of methodologies, and again, due to historical accidents, the wrong team won. I mean, there was economics, if you just think about it without having preconceptions created by textbooks, how would we study the economics of Pakistan? Well, we will have to look into history, what is being produced, which factories are operation, who did what to whom, what was the politics, what was the... but economics does nothing like that. Economics starts out with mathematical equations. Why? Because economics is trapped in the battle of methodology. The historical context and the qualitative ideas that were at the heart of economics before then were thrown out and replaced by a mathematical and scientific law framework, which is actually the wrong approach to economics. And the third major mistake occurred in the early 20th century by this emergence of this philosophy called logical positivism, which is actually a mistake, and it was discovered to be a mistake. Logical positivism is a particular understanding of science. It says that science deals only with observables. Now this is very strange, because we know that science deals with gravity and with electrons, and with huge numbers. So positivists had found a very clever philosophical maneuver in which they found that you can take every observable and replace it by its equivalent unobservable, and they thought that this would be... So basically this comes from, again, the deification of science and the rejection of religion, the unseen. When you want to reject the unseen, they wanted to reject electrons and gravity as well, but of course you can't do that. And later on, in the middle of the 20th century, this philosophy collapsed, and it was realized that you cannot do what they... But regardless, it became extremely popular. In the 1930s, Lionel Robbins reconstructed the foundations of economics on positivist grounds, and he rejected the earlier definitions of economics. And this new definition, the scarcity definition, which we all now know and use, is actually based on foundations which are known to be wrong. So I'll go into a little bit greater detail about these three mistakes. So we've already discussed how... I think that in interest of time I will not go over it, but let me just briefly mention how did this battle between science and religion get started. Actually, the point is that when Eurocentric history we learn, we are told that the Enlightenment was a spontaneous event which occurred all by itself. Suddenly the light of reason dawned in Europe without any cause apparent. But actually there was an advanced Islamic society in Andalus which was functioning for 700 years, and when it went into decay and degeneration, the European barbarians at the time, the name sounds bad, but actually that's what happened, and they conquered, and this is any time-old pattern in history where old and decaying civilizations get taken over by barbarians who then become civilized. So they acquired a treasure trove of millions of books, which they had an enormous amount of difficulty digesting. 2 centuries of European history is all about the influx of knowledge and the Catholic attempt to suppress this knowledge by censorship, by inquisition, by the friend of Copernicus named Squiltitus was a priest who was tortured and imprisoned for 10 years by the Catholic Church for his ideas. So Copernicus was just a translator. I mean, he's known as a revolutionary, but he actually translated the astronomical works of Ibn Shatir, which were available to him in his library, but he never claimed he couldn't. I mean, he was afraid to. If you look at the preface of his book and how he's so obsequious to religious authority, and he tries to present his work as not a revolutionary work in order to avoid arousing the anger of the religious authorities. So this so-called science was actually a body of alien knowledge that suddenly flooded Europe, and they didn't have, it took them 2 centuries to actually absorb it and assimilate it. And in the process, there was this huge conflict between the Orthodox religion, which was very medieval in its outlook, and the modern outlook. So that was the source of the battle between religion and science. So the consequences of the victory of science were very fateful for not just Europe, for the whole world, because basically the Catholic Church broke up into factions and they fought each other, and they had very bloody, violent battles. And as a result, Europeans became disenchanted with religion, and Max Weber has explained how actually the Protestant ethic, you see, the Catholic religion was extremely otherworldly. They said, you know, the monks take vow of poverty is the ideal state, and not being married is the ideal state. So marriage is a concession to weakness, and so on. This is very different from Islam, which says that you should not be a monk and you should not retire to caves, and you should live in the normal life. So some rejection of these ideas went to the other extreme, and some Protestant factions began to think of wealth and worldly materials as being a sign of the favor of God. And this actually, Max Weber points out, this is what this was the foundation of capitalism. So one of the effects of this was in increasing materialism. But the other effect, which was equally important, was that the morality, you see, economics was a branch of moral philosophy. This was dropped from science, from economics, because science is completely blind to morality. Science can tell us about the material world, but what's inside the hearts of men, what is good, what is evil, science has this is not its domain. And so when science became considered as the only domain of, only valid source of knowledge, then all possible access to morality was lost. So what happened was that there were alternative theories of, you cannot live with morality, without morality. We have to know what is good and what is bad. So alternative theories of morality were developed. In fact, Jeremy Bentham was the prophet of a newly founded religion of humanity. And what he said is that, after of course rejecting Christianity, he said that basically pleasure and pain are our guides to morality. If something makes me happy, that's good and moral. And if something hurts me, that is bad and immoral. And that is the theory of utilitarianism, which is currently also a philosophy. And that is at the heart of modern economic theory. So this is a really serious problem, because this pleasure-pain principle does not actually provide a sound basis for morality. The alternative basis was the social consensus. There are these 2 major ideas for how you can build morality without religion. One is this utilitarianism, the other is the social contract, which says if we all agree to something, then it becomes moral. But this foundation has empirically proven to be very treacherous, because if a German society agrees to burn all 6 million Jews, then this becomes a moral act. Just when I went to the USA, homosexuality was considered immoral, illegal, it was a crime, it was a psychological disease. In the 1990s, it's normal. To talk against it is a crime and you can get into jail. So there is no foundation for, things can change. If we all agree to X today, we can all agree to the opposite tomorrow. So it doesn't provide a solid basis. So economics is actually, some of the major issues in economics involve morality, and human beings are intrinsically moral. It is not that we are born with a sense of justice. And this has been proven over and over again by experiments. It's not. So modern economics, because it excluded morals, it teaches us some very poisonous things about how human beings are inherently selfish, and there is this concept of the sub-game perfect equilibrium. What it says is that in a game, if you make a commitment at an earlier stage of the game, and at a later stage it is to your advantage to betray that commitment, then you should betray that commitment, because everyone always seeks self-interest. So this was actually taught at Harvard, and there was a big scandal at the time that Harvard is teaching immorality. But economists are told that it is in our self-interest to betray the other party in the famous game theory model called prisoner's dilemma, when actually it's simply false both empirically and rationally. I mean, if people forego self-interest for the greater good, actually it helps everybody. And there are so many cases where if we all agree that we will not pursue self-interest, then the whole society is better off. This is a very common situation in the commons and so on. So, but economists believe otherwise. They have been trained to believe otherwise. So Ariel Rubinstein, who is a very famous game theorist, he said, you know, economists are victims of game theory. When you run the experiment on 12,000 subjects, that you give them $100 and you say, okay, how much, and you put them next to a stranger and say, okay, you are free to share this however you like. So now economic theory predicts that you will take everything, because you are maximizing your utility. Every human being is greedy. But actually about half of these people split 50-50. And so this is very contrary to what, if you put an economist among them, he behaves according to the economic theory. This is, so he says that these people are victims of their theory. They teach these wrong theories, and then they start believing in them, and then start acting according to them. And this is very harmful to them for their own lives, because behaving like an economist is really not very socially apt. And if you do that, you will damage your standing in society, which is the most important. If you damage your personal relationships, you will cause harm to yourself. So morality is at the heart of economics. Are people entitled to get their basic needs? If we export wheat and we import luxury cars, is this a good thing to do or a bad thing to do? Many of these questions, you can answer these on the basis of how many dollars you will make. Economists are confined to calculating how many dollars this will make, but the real issues they are unable to address. If we say, economists say, for example, that okay, you should have free competition. If your industry collapses, fine, let it collapse, because you don't have comparative advantage. But what about all those lives, all those people who lose jobs and the effect on their families? This is not taken into account in the economic calculus. So economics is blind on these affairs. And why? Because of the first fundamental mistake. The second mistake was the adoption of science and the quantitative method instead of history and qualitative method. So the consequences of this was that there is a book called by Geoffrey Hodgson, that how economics forgot history. Now, the idea of science is that we need to find universal laws. So are there any universal laws? Is there a mathematical formula I can use to describe human behavior, which will be the same in Brazil in 19th century, and the same in England in 20th century, and the same in Pakistan in 21st century? There are no such laws. Human behavior is not subject to mathematical law. So the idea, similarly, you see, if you look at economic trade theory, you look at the PhD text, you will find that it's full of equations and mathematics. But now if I want to study the trade between Pakistan and India, I will have to look at history, the context, what are we producing, but according to the scientific view, we are not interested in those things which are historical, local. I mean, if I come up with some idea about what we should do today, that will not be true tomorrow. But then it's not science, because science is something which is time invariant, which is a universal law. So this leads to massively bad theories. I mean, if I want to study economics of the 20th century, I should study the World War I, World War II, its impact on Europe, etc. In no graduate program in economics will you be taught this, because this is just history. So how can students learn what economics is if they don't understand the historical context? even economic theory itself is a product of history. And if you want to understand what economic theory is, you have to look at the historical origins. So this is what leads to the poverty of economics in terms of its ability to deal with modern problems. So what are the remedies? Well, we have to put all of these things back which were taken out. We have to put back historical and political and social context. Institutional, you see, actually there's a lot of body of knowledge we can call upon. Before the 1930s, economics was at least situated in history, and they did have more sense about human beings and their nature. The welfare structure, what is human welfare? This is again something which economics is completely blind about. New studies called happiness, started by Easterlin, who was my colleague in Pennsylvania, have revolutionized the subject and have shown that, you know, our mad pursuit of wealth does not actually bring happiness to anybody. So maybe we should try a different strategy. I'm going to pass over this since time is short. So at the foundations of economics, the older conceptions were concerned with welfare of men, and they understood that feeding a child some milk is more important, it produces more welfare than giving a glass of wine to an aristocrat. But this idea was lost in the transition to scarcity definition. And the modern economists said that we cannot differentiate between wants and needs because that's a condition of the heart. If somebody says, I want X, then our job is to just provide. We will not ask what's inside his heart. Is this an idle desire or whether this is a genuine need? So modern economics does not differentiate between these things. And this is a serious defect. So positivism throws out the unobservables, and so basically, you know, Samuelson came up with this theory of revealed preference. Previously, there was the idea of utility. In my heart, how much benefit do I derive from something? That cannot be measured, but choices can be seen. So if I'm offered A and B and I choose B, then that means that I prefer B to A, and that is observable. So this is the standard positivist strategy of replacing the unobservable by the observable. But just like it failed to work for gravity and electrons, so it fails to work for human beings. The intensity of the feeling in the heart is extremely important. The need with which a person who is hungry seeks bread is very different from the desire from a person to listen to music. So, but economics no longer differentiates between the two, whereas it used to be done. So the most important damage caused by logical positivism was that knowledge was redefined to be that of the external world, not of the hearts of human beings. And economics is all about making people happy. So unless you know something about using material means to achieve happiness, welfare, satisfaction. So if you are blind to what's inside the hearts of men, that this is a goal you cannot achieve, and we see the results, the massive amount of damage being done to environment, communities, the fact that there are 8 people who own half of the planet and 3.5 billion people have less. All of this damage being done because people are blind to the, lost their compassion for the poor. So what are the solutions? Well, as I said, the solutions are not accessible in the mainstream, in the heartlands of economics, but here in the periphery, we are free to make changes. So the first priority is to create a realistic theory of human behavior and welfare. Humans do not maximize utility. That's conclusive. Human beings are social. Their behavior is governed by cultural norms. Human welfare does not depend on consumption. This is a major mistake that economists make, that we should maximize our consumption. The mistake is very easy to understand. It's like if you're hot and thirsty, if you drink Coca-Cola, it makes you happy, of course. But if you think that this is the formula for human happiness in your life, then you are seriously mistaken. And actually, this is exactly the formula which is being taught to the world, that how to be happy, just consume more goods. And unfortunately, people are taken in by this false philosophy. But the studies of happiness shows that happiness does not depend on consumption. It depends on character. It depends on cultivating certain inner characteristics of the heart. And these things are completely out of the curriculum because this is not positive. This is not observable. So we need to reintroduce these. Similarly, when we talk about human development, we talk about capabilities, how to provide people with job skills. That is a peripheral matter. It's the teaching people. Actually, human beings have immense amount of potential. How can we teach a human being to be a really human being? That was actually what the Prophet ﷺ did. He taught people how to be human beings, and that is what launched the revolution. So there is a huge amount of existing research which can be harnessed into this new agenda which we are working on. So it has been recognized that there are no mechanical rules which people follow, but there are certain heuristics of behavior, and they are being very actively studied. And we can use these, and we are studying these. The textbooks on behavioral and experimental economics are working with real human behavior, and they are providing lots of insights, and we are incorporating in this into our studies. There is new methodologies, new methods for studying the complex economy, which we are utilizing. The modern economic theory is handicapped by a very simple thing, that computers did not exist when it was invented. And to this day, the mindset of the economist theorist is to formulate the problem in such a way that he can solve it on pencil and paper. Unfortunately, the economy is so complex that it's impossible to do that. So what you can do today, which was not possible 30 years ago, is that you can create an economy with thousands of agents, give them all different complex rules of behavior, which we know how to do now, and then feed it to the computer to tell me what will happen. So this methodology is called agent-based modeling. We had a course on that last semester, and we are incorporating these new ideas actively. The economists worked with disequilibrium models. That's based on 19th century physics. Today, people who study dynamic systems, actually Lucas enshrined this into the heart of economic theory by saying that only equilibrium is admissible as a consistent model. And this is really a huge mistake. In fact, this is one of the mistakes that led to the global financial crisis, because they couldn't conceive of the idea of disequilibrium within their theories. Now, people who study dynamic systems know that equilibrium is not any... systems are mostly in disequilibrium, and it's the disequilibrium dynamics which governs the behavior of the system. If you refuse to study disequilibrium, you will never find out how the system behaves. Now, if you look at the textbook Varian, he starts out by saying that we are committed to maximization and equilibrium, two things which have been proven wrong. That, we don't want to talk about anything which goes outside of equilibrium. So these are the driving ideas. Then there are tools which are mathematics, statistics, and econometrics. Again, in all of these areas, there have been major innovations. Today, for example, all over the world, people are teaching mathematics based on Alpha Chiang to economists. And basically, this methodology is to teach economists how to solve mathematical problems on pencil and paper. Now, actually, this is an obsolete technology. Today, what we need to do, if we want, we can teach students very advanced mathematics very easily by teaching them how to formulate and conceptualize the problem and then feed it to the computer. They don't need to use the calculus to solve that problem. It's like teaching students how to multiply two 10-digit numbers by hand. It is an interesting skill, but it is obsolete. It's no longer necessary. So today, a lot of teaching that is being done in statistics, in econometrics, in mathematics, this is based on the idea that there is no computer. So what we do instead in econometrics and statistics is to substitute convenient assumptions, like assuming that the error is normal. When you make that assumption, then the calculations required simplify immensely. But they are wrong because the data is not normal. So there is massive amounts of, the whole body of knowledge that currently exists that we are teaching is seriously deficient, and it is possible to make serious and dramatic improvements, and we are working on these things. So PIDE is preparing for the 20th century. Thank you.